Welcome to this Autism Awareness Day webinar by the European Council of Autistic People. We will speak today about a topic that we handled in a previous webinar already, experiences of autistic people being subjected to violence by others. We find this an incredibly important topic and a neglected one. We find that in research and in media, we too often see only the portrayals of autistic people as potentially aggressive, as potentially the perpetrators of violence. And the other side receives much, too little attention. So we are really grateful to the European Women's Lobby for understanding the importance of this topic and funding this project, which has been run by Sarah Rocha in leading a small international team of autistic researchers. This is a topic that touches so many of our lives. I believe that there are hardly any autistic people who are not at some point in their lives subjected to some type of violence. And we are often the ones who do not report, that do not believe that there is any sense in going to others, telling about it, seeking help. This is today, the project has come to the important stage of publicizing the stories beyond violence that Sarah and the team have been collecting. And this grew from the originally intended 10 stories to the current 16, touching on many different aspects, different types of violence. I'd like to give the floor to Sarah to tell us about the book that is being publicized today.
Hi everyone, my name is Sarah. I am leading the project, and today I will speak a little bit about the stories and why this come up, and then in the end of my intervention I will share the link for you to download the stories and you can see for yourself what we are publishing. So when we were developing this idea for the survey to research a little bit more about experiences of violence, something that came up constantly, it's how intrinsic to autistic people's lives, different types of violence, and sometimes types that we are not expecting to happen, or something that is extremely specific to autistic people's lives to show up. So I think initially when we started developing what types of violence are we going to approach it, we realized that it is very hard to see through prevalences how much just systemic violence is in autistic people's lives. And I think that what led to our idea of opening stories and writing writings from autistic people, because that way it's not only what percentage was exposed to a specific type of violence, it gives us an idea of how much different types of even microaggressions can lead to trauma. And there is one saying in the autistic community that varies on something like, there is no autistic people without trauma. And although there's always people in every community without trauma, through this assignment, through this project, we did see how little people without autistic people without trauma, without systemic violence, institutional violence are, and how important this topic is. So throughout these stories, they were initially to be 10. Now we have 16, mainly because I don't think we could possibly decide which one is more important. All of them are incredibly important all of them in different topics. We have from police restraints and meltdowns to sexual violence, to the violence of undiagnosed or not receiving a diagnosis, discrimination, medical malpractice, psychiatric confinement. So first of all, I want to give a trigger warning on this type of topics because they are tough to read, but they're needed. And I think this is one of the most important parts of our project because knowing the prevalences, knowing how much this is common in people's lives is important, but knowing stories, I think it completely gives you a different idea of how important it is to have more projects around this topic. So I will share here the link so you can download it in the chat. You can have access. Some of the authors decided to be anonymous. Some added their name. I am aware that some are here. So eventually we're going to open the floor. And if someone wants to share something, just feel free to do so. But don't feel like you need to, because obviously it was just it was just a very tough thing to write to us. And we do want to thank everyone that wrote, but you don't need to also expose yourself if you don't feel comfortable to. So I shared the link. So what are we going to do next? This ebook will be available for anyone to download it, to read it, to share it. Please do, because these stories need to reach other areas. It has some really important information that needs even to reach policies. We have stories on psychiatric confinement, which is something that it still happens in the EU, and we need to fight, for example. So next step, also, we will have the report that we should have a final report on the study in the end of the month. We will share it with you also, and then you can just download it freely and see what results we had. Although we did have the webinar on some preliminary results that you can revisit and see it. And I think those are the main topics. I will pass to Susie. I know it was a bit brief, but I am very aware that you probably will want to read the ebook then with more time. So I'm going to ask if it will be available on the UCAP's website. Yes, we will add it to the website right after the webinar end. Susie?
Hi, thanks a lot, Sada, and thanks very much, Heta, as well, for inviting me along again. I read this book with a lot of interest, and it's incredibly important. I'm autistic myself. I have autistic family, and I've been supporting autistic people within academia for almost 20 years now, but also in the field of sexual violence. And I write about that. I talk about that. I'm someone who is a survivor, and I don't see that there's enough talk about how many autistic people are survivors of not just sexual violence, because many might not be, but violence on its own. There's an awful lot of talk about violence without people actually even realizing that that's what they're talking about, because we don't give a name to it in society. And it's almost as though with autistic people, with disabled people, that we're almost expected to accept it. And there should be no reason why we do. There should be no reason why we're silenced, why we have our voices pushed to one side, why our children's voices are pushed to one side. And, you know, we need to have that space. We need to be able to reclaim that space. And I think the words that we use are really, really important. And that's what came across through reading every single story, was that people were choosing to use very different words, very different terminology to express their experiences. And there was almost, I don't think, any single person who was talking about exactly the same thing. But in many ways, there was this sort of theme that ran through about an incredibly uncaring an insensitive society, people who just really blatantly don't understand or don't want to understand the needs of autistic people. And I think that's shameful. It's absolutely disgraceful. It doesn't matter what country we're in. Surely, as a humane person, you would make an attempt to understand the needs of people who are in distress. And if you don't have a voice, even more so, because it's more distressing not being able to put words to your experiences that you find painful or hurtful or frightening. The very first story, where the writer talked about a meltdown and police restraints, how frightening that that person was not recognised as experiencing huge amounts of fear and needing space. I've worked with people who are in meltdowns and had a huge crowd of people around me saying, oh, what should we do? What should we do? And just creating more fear. And I've just said, go away, move back, give them space, just leave her and me. And as soon as they did, that person had space to calm down. But the more people who are around, the worse the situation gets. And the police are a trigger warning in themselves. Their bright yellow jackets, their handcuffs, their truncheons, the sirens, the lights, everything is very, very triggering. So of course that's going to make a meltdown worse. And the police, who actually, as I was saying the other week when I was talking with this team, the people I train in the UK, they all need training. They all need training in understanding autism. Many of them really do want that training. Many of them are too scared to ask, but they need to know. I think as soon as we close down conversations, things bubble away below the surface. They don't go away, they're still there. You know, autistic people, we have been experiencing trauma, as this project shows. We've been experiencing trauma forever. We've been experiencing violence forever. And the fact that people now feel confident enough to use those words to describe their experiences is really critical. It's not a new thing that that those experiences have been traumatic or have been violent, but it's perhaps new that people are using those words now. And I think that there's more and more people who are using those words in, you know, whatever country, really, whatever culture. And I think the fact that different cultures are talking to that theme too is critical, because one culture may not see violence in the same way as another. And I certainly have that sort of thing within my own family, because we're combined heritage. So it's really important for us to talk about it. So I always encourage people to. I think there was another really interesting story. Well, all of the stories I thought were fascinating, but another one that I wanted to draw attention to was the one about GP medical malpractice and the potential fatal results that could have had. Because an awful lot of autistic people can't actually speak when they're traumatized, can't actually speak if people aren't listening to them or understanding their insider experience and sort of rubbishing them. So the fact that you've got somebody in a position of power who's telling you that your insider expertise, your health experience is nonsense, I mean, that's going to shut you up, isn't it? Or go the other way, you're going to speak even louder. But in the country where this person was, they didn't say their country, but them being sent back home all the time, I mean, that's layer upon layer upon layer of trauma, but it could have been fatal. And I think it was really important that that type of story is there, because medical malpractice is really, really rife in the autism community, in the autism experiences and narratives. And I think we really need to call medical practitioners out. I know I do, and I encourage it. But, you know, we have got obviously some very good practitioners, and we really need to sort of praise them. But the ones who aren't, the ones who don't get it right, I mean, let's mention it. You know, I'm not going to sugarcoat things. If people get things wrong and I'm suffering because of it, it's time that we mention this. It's time for everybody to have a voice about our trauma, the violence it impacts on us. One other thing that I want to say, because the whole book is really very much about violence, very much about trauma. And I think that's really, really important. But the flip side of that coin is looking at narratives of recovery. And so the moment that you have trauma, this is how I see it, this is how I write about it, this is how I train about it, but I always have conversations. So I recognize that other people's experiences and views are different. The flip side of this is that as soon as you have experienced something traumatic, you are then in a process of recovery. Now, whether you're able to move because you've got a monotropic mindset, whether you're able to move from that focus on your trauma to a slightly different focus where you're beginning to be able to recover, that's the bit that's going to take the time. And for some people, that never happens. And that's the big difference between a lot of autistic people and people who are neurotypical or people who are non-autistic. That monotropic mindset. But I think narratives of recovery are fascinating in themselves, and I think they do give that balance and sense of hope for the future. It's not like we've experienced trauma, so that's it, you know, we're broken pieces, you know, forget us now. We can still contribute to society. We've still got skills, we've still got talents. We just want to be able to talk about the trauma that's happened, the malpractice that's happened, this institutionalized violence that is ongoing. And we need things to be put right. We need things to be addressed. And we have a right to have that done under human rights legislation.
I see no other hands up, so I will at this point take a turn to comment myself, and anyone else who wants to say something, please raise your hand, and if I do not notice you, then just unmute and make a noise. I have slightly poor eyesight and I may miss some hands. So to comment firstly on what Susie said about the story of medical neglect, that was from Finland. There was Elina here, who was, I would say, at the receiving end of this kind of a polite and passive form of violence, and just doesn't easily get called violent. But when someone's life is at risk, that's how it needs to be called. Elina is a young woman who is now with us only because of the vigilance and persistence of her mother. So that tells me that someone who does not have that intelligent and vigilant and persistent parent will die in the Finnish system. That is exactly how serious it is. And the sheer scale of these problems is a little bit daunting, because it seems to be the rule rather than the exception. We are just now having on Finnish media institutions exposed for constantly over-medicating, essentially using chemical restraint is no major constant ongoing practice. That to me has come as a bit of a surprise. Is one of the first autistic campaigning groups that I ran into in the 1990s over 20 years ago was Autistic People Against Neuroleptic Abuse. And I somehow got the impression that the problem was being solved. Apparently not. It goes on in exactly the same form. It may be a little bit better in the UK and places where the most active campaign knows who say no. It's still not better. Yes, and we're hearing of practices in Finnish institutions of people being confined, like essentially incarcerated and being allowed outdoors for 15 minutes a day, some of them on a leash. No, these are utterly unacceptable. But when there's like too much of this, people stop to react. And one of the topmost things in my mind at the moment is how to get this into the reporting to the UNCRPD in Finland's country report. And if we get it there, what will actually happen? And will it happen within months or years or like 10 years time? And what does it mean in the lives of these people?
I'm one of the contributors, and I just wanted to thank you all, and thank the organization for raising awareness of this and for allowing me to contribute. One of the things that particularly came up for me in what I submitted was the as Susie, as you spoke about as well, the late diagnosis and trying to re-evaluate your life history and some of the violences and traumas that have happened to you, and the fact that I had taken ownership for the actions of others that wasn't mine to hold. It wasn't mine. I hadn't committed it, and I had accepted my reaction and my not disclosing it and my subsequent silence. That it had no meaning, and the feelings of guilt and shame were never mine. And I was determined part of the realignment of my own identity, my acceptance of my own autistic identity, to reclaim that power of agency for myself. And I felt that was a really important aspect, both in both in my contribution and some of the others, several of the others, the reclaiming of our own voice in this. I'm also working with the organization Autistic Parents UK and trying to set up a peer support program, because I am an autistic parent, and there are times that I know of neurodivergent children. I have 2 neurodivergent children, and there are times that I understand that my reactions to societal expectations have at times impacted both myself and them. And setting up a peer support system, a one-to-one peer support system for autistic parents to hopefully enable further understanding of some of the reasons why this may be happening, and support our children and break the cycles of trauma, I think will be really important. I'm very grateful to also still be doing a PhD on sexual violence and late diagnosis, reclaiming identity at University of Kent. So hopefully I will continue working on some of these aspects. But thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Katharina. That was really interesting. And do feel free to get in touch with me if you want to or need to. It'd be interesting to exchange views and things. I do think, one of the things that I wanted to pick up on again that I missed earlier, but none of these stories talk about autistic people seeing ourselves as perpetrators. But all of them have somewhere some implicit sort of message that we've been treated as a perpetrator because, we're the other end, we're the wrong end of violence. And if you're not seen as a victim, well, the opposite of a victim is a perpetrator, or you just don't matter. So, I mean, what are you? Where are you on that sort of narrative scale is what I'm thinking. And I think very often that people don't have the words to say what their experiences are. Words to me are really important, or communication is really important. So if you don't have words, there are different ways of communicating. And if you see someone who's distressed, that does not mean, like in the meltdown experience, that does not mean there's something wrong with that person, but it does mean there's something extremely wrong with the environment, with the people around them, with whatever experience that has been happening, or within the medical system. You know, what has been happening there? What has been going wrong there? I mean, a whole sort of context need to be evaluated appropriately, or even at all, because I just see that whole contextual experiences are just ignored. That's not something that happens to neurotypical people. People spend ages telling stories about, you know, what was happening here, what was going on there, but not with autistic people. It's very sort of direct to the point. Oh yes, well, they kicked off. They were shouting and screaming. They bit someone. They hit someone. You know, and so we're in perpetrator position. Or if you've got an autistic person who's following someone down the road, they're stalking them. Whereas the autistic person might be interested in talking to them because they've seen they were interested in something that this other person was also fascinated in, but they're immediately labeled as a stalker. So rather than people engaging in any form of conversation or meaningful conversation, there's a label put on there, put on the person, and that is just so wrong. And I think that that needs to come out very much in maybe future work. You know, the perpetrator side of it, the recovery side of it as well, those two as well as these stories.
Suddenly there's like so much interesting conversations to pick up here. So I wanted to give some notes and comments on some of the things that were talked. One of them, it's neuroleptics, antipsychotics. In Portugal, is extremely common. We had, for example, cases, and I will talk about one specific case of an autistic girl that she was getting meltdowns every day when she would come home from school. And it's completely normal if you think about it, because finally she gets to her safe space and she can just let it go and have a meltdown in her safe space, while in school she was constantly overwhelmed. And what came out of it was actually they went to the doctor because she was having a lot of tantrums, and they gave her antipsychotics for those tantrums. And the thing is, she continued to get even worse every day, and they continued to increase the medication that she was on. And when I asked what type of adaptations are she's having in schools, the answer was, what adaptations? And I think neuroleptics, and medical abuse should be in the order of the day every time we talk about violence in autistic people, being from refusal of diagnosis to refusal of even chronic illness, which are extremely common also in autistic people, to over-medication, to psychiatric confinement. One of the, I think it's the last, not the last story, but before that one, it's about psychiatric confinement, and it happened in my country, Portugal. And I think the importance of that is, in the UK, we are aware, for example, that more than 100 people been for more than 25 years in inpatient unit in psychiatric confinement. These are autistic people. There's more than 1,000, and the average of their stay is around 5 years. However, there are other countries that have exactly the same. Maybe not 5 years, maybe not 25, but they're still medicalizing and pathologizing our traits and putting us into psychiatric wards, which is just another type of reinstitutionalization. So this is incredibly important to talk. One of the things that I would like to pick up is something that Susie says on having words to describe. And I see more and more that the problem here is that the words that are given to us are neurotypical words. And we need to find an autistic grammar, not for the whole autistic community, but for ourselves, because we were all going to have different grammar and different forms to describe how we feel and how violence affected our lives. And I think that's an incredible, important thing when we think about recovery, because how can we process and reform and empower through revision of our own story if we can't find our own words to describe what happened to us. And this leads to one thing that I see a lot of normally non-autistic researchers talking about violence in autistic people as people that we are more vulnerable, and we are more vulnerable because we are autistic. I personally do not like that description. I think we are put into a state of vulnerabilization, which is something that this word doesn't exist in English, but it exists in Portuguese, and I quite like it, because of the constant discrimination and the constant invalidation of our own experience and words. And that is important also to understand that we are not this vulnerable people that are just being violated or receiving this violence because we are autistic. It's because the system is constantly discriminating against us. And until we change the system, it doesn't matter if we think, let's try to prevent violence, because this system will continue to do this by medical professionals, by not having the proper support in shelters, in women's domestic violence services, etc. So I just wanted to add this point. And if we can't find our own words to describe, we can't also show how this affected us. So if we have both non-speaking and speaking people, we will present our mental health outcomes in a different way than people that are neurotypical. So if we can't understand how to see mental health difficulties in autistic people, that will also be another block in our recovery. And that happens, for example, with PTSD, especially complex PTSD, and how we present traits differently, and professionals then can diagnose us or can support us because of that. I think this is an incredibly important conversation, and I would like to see if someone else would like to join, because it's nice to have different perspectives. Would anyone would like to say anything? If you want, we can also stop the recording. You can say it to us in the chat if you want to share something, but you don't want to be recorded.
I'm just going to briefly comment on your thoughts on vulnerability. I believe that is an official term in the UK. Probably many other countries don't have something exactly the same, but they probably have some words or concepts to describe anyway someone who is assumed to be somehow, more, exposed to the possibility of others attacking them. But I think it ties in with some of my experiences and observations in that a child who is put into a setting where many other children have some impulse control problems and may attack them at any time, that child is not particularly vulnerable. They're just being put in a situation where that is everyday life and the staff don't care. That is making the child vulnerable. Similarly, with a psychiatric patient who is put in a ward with someone who maybe has some sociopathic tendencies, who just enjoys bullying someone else. And again, you have no escape. You have staff who don't care. Yes, you are being made into a victim. No, it is not anything in that person that makes them particularly vulnerable, other than how they are interpreted and where they are put and what the practices around them are.
I'm from Portugal, Sarah, and I'm really worried, concerned, and about children in Portugal, because children in Portugal are, and families are, under such a degree of violence in terms of institutional violence, education and health, the main ones, being the main ones. Children are given antipsychotics at the age 2-3 years by protocol. So I'm in touch with a lot of families, I know a lot of kids, and this is so hard to see every day. Kids are not being given access to any kind of alternative communication by practice. Speech pathologists are not even 10% of them. I don't have the right numbers, as you can imagine, but from my experience, and this is absolutely, if we, I think we're like 20-30 years behind some of your experiences and countries. Heta, you were talking about the 90s, and you can't even imagine how the 90s were in Portugal. But to be honest, maybe I've heard older people saying that today is even worse, maybe, because of there's too much diagnosis, or I don't know exactly what's happening. But the truth is, we are actually, I'm trying to find the right word. Torture comes to mind, and children are really being mistreated and neglected and abused in my country every day, most of them, and this is really hard. I just needed to share that with you today. Thank you.
I have someone in my family, one of my siblings, who is autistic and has spent most of his life in and out of mental health care with the wrong diagnosis also attached due to abuse by a family member. And it has proved absolutely impossible for me. I'm not someone who can't speak. It has proved impossible for me to change that diagnosis and get people to view him differently. And I've spoken to the highest people in that system. So unless I go through a very, very long and lengthy and expensive court case, which I can't afford, my brother stays where he is, on medication that he should not be on. And it's absolutely heartbreaking. So I totally get those stories from other people. It's worrying that misdiagnosis happens at all. It's worrying that it happens when people know it happens and they continue to do that. It's worrying that they use medication that they should not use, and they ignore people. So practice needs to change.
Thank you, first of all, for the webinar, and thanks to everyone for your contributions. Coming to the issue of medication. So it is one of the many issues which actually did strike a chord for me too. There's one particular thing which, however, is also disturbing, because we've all, or at least many of us, have been through experiences where we're invalidated by medical professionals who will actually not listen to us. However, there's also the concern that, even in certain medical texts, for example, the British National Formulary comes to mind. It was in Malta, we refer to that document. Doctors refer to that document, when prescribing certain medications, basically have a list of different medications and saying, okay, so this is actually safe for condition X or condition Y, symptom X and symptom Y. Without going through too many details, for example, particular drug comes to mind, chloral hydrate, which is a pretty, let's say, heavy drug, but apparently the BNF, British National Formulary, says that it's actually safe for autistic kids of a very young age to be used as a sedative, when actually research and practice shows that it actually is not. So something that actually comes to mind is this. In the UK, there was the Westminster Commission on Autism, which actually looked into therapies and looked at the good, the bad, and the ugly. So maybe even, let's say, advocacy work, an important thing would be not only to sensitize medical professionals as to, listening to people, to autistic people, but also to actually look at texts which are seen as a Bible by medical professionals. So you might have a doctor who's actually very well-meaning, saying, okay, but I checked the BNF, and this is okay because it's actually in there. Well, actually, these are the things that actually need to change. Just wanted to bring that up. Thanks again.
Okay. Flapper McFluttery on the text channel said that this is just the first step, and I fully agree. So what are the next steps? I would like to ask Sarah and anyone who's been involved in writing a book, like, has anything come up that would kind of suggest the next steps? And also, Alistair, if you have any thoughts on this, as a lawyer, as in how could we make it easier for people to report? How could we somehow make it more likely that they get justice if they do?
Well, the first step is the publishing. We are publishing. We're going to publish the report also that has incredibly important information exactly on everything that was talked about, including, for example, around 10% of the people that answered, of the 259 people that answer, were over-medicated at some point or exposed to harmful treatment in autism. So the survey would also give us some idea of the different types of violence that are not common in general population, but seems to be incredibly common within autistic community. Once we have the report, we can start advocating with it. So we intend to open for translation for any member from EUCAP to their own language. And with that, we intend to pressure on governments and pressure the EU to take steps into ensuring that people with disabilities and autistic people in particular have services, have support, and have ways for us to actually do any changes on these stories and to make sure that this doesn't happen again. One of the things that we do urgently need is research. So we need more research in these stories. We need to understand better how the institutional and systemic discrimination of autistic people lead to these stories and how we can break it. So one of the things is starting to fund, finally, the social model of disability, because even the EU continues to fund the medical model, and we continue to give money to biology and biological treatments and try to find the cure or the genetics or whatever in autism. And billions were spent on that, but not enough are being spent into understanding how the social factors and the socio-demographic and socioeconomic factors affect this type of violence and how to stop it. And essentially, as Susie was saying, how we can actually step into recovery and what type of recovery, what is neurodivergent therapy that are neurodivergent friendly and autistic friendly. How can we get there and heal from these types of violence? So I think it's one of the most important steps in terms of reporting. I think I will probably know a little bit more about this, but the European Union are building a system of reporting. We will continue to push to ensure that autistic voices are included, because we are aware that we have barriers on the reporting at every step of the way. And I think this also will help to understand how this happens, what type of barriers people have from not being able to speak, not being able to share their stories from beginning to end because of anxiety, and how they feel because they're overwhelmed in a situation of the reporting, from lack of knowledge on autism, and many, many others. So this is one step, and we intend to take many others after this, being with using this report and this ebook to push for change, or hopefully eventually another project to follow up and to try to build something after that. So I will pass to Alistair. Maybe you want to share something.
At European Union level, I'd like to start from there, since you mentioned that, there's like what's known as an independent monitoring mechanism. So technically, any country that has like ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, UNCRPD, has to have an implementing body and a monitoring body. So the European Union itself, as a body, like as an entity, aside from the different national governments, has also like ratified this convention. So it also has its own monitoring body. This is made up of 4 different like organizations. So basically, you've got the European Ombudsman, you have the European Union Fundamental Rights Agency, European Parliament, and European Disability Forum. So what happens is this: they meet regularly, like all four of them, to be able to assess concerns and complaints. So any complaint that goes to any of these four bodies basically can be discussed jointly by them, but also they can also use their own modes of action to tackle something. And the European Disability Forum, it is an umbrella organization in the same way as UCAP is. So it's basically a collection of NGOs from around Europe. So like any NGO or any person can actually like also reach out to them. However, like with the European Parliament, then it's all about seeing who your member of European Parliament is. It's good to actually look at what's called the Disability Intergroup within the European Parliament. That is like a collection of MEPs, members of European Parliament, who specifically work on disability rights. There's all different EU countries represented there, so you can actually check. There's publicly available information online if there's MEPs from your country in the intergroup, because if you bring up disability-specific issues to them or autism-specific issues, they can actually bring them up in discussions, like pose questions in the plenary of European Parliament, bring up points when discussing legislation. For example, right now there's legislation which will soon be in front of Parliament again as regards like gender-based violence and domestic violence. So it's important to also like go through your MEP. With the European Ombudsman, this is like a European body. It's basically like mostly when you have European Union specific initiatives that are not being disability friendly or autism friendly. So if you actually like have any complaints about any European project, you can actually go to the European Ombudsman. When it actually comes to issues happening at national level specifically, but you actually want to bring them at EU level, the European Union Fundamental Rights Agency is an important body that you can actually refer to. There's also contact details through their website. They publish regular reports. For example, they had like reports about institutionalization. Also, let's say when it actually comes to psychiatric confinement, they've also touched on that issue. So like it's important to actually reach out to the Fundamental Rights Agency. In their own right, they are a watchdog for fundamental rights around the EU, not just when it comes to disability rights, but also like any other kind of fundamental rights. But as I mentioned, they're also part of the European Union's monitoring mechanism. Now, going beyond these bodies at EU level, it's important also, like Heta mentioned earlier, the United Nations and the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, it's actually called. So this is like a committee within the EU. It's responsible for reviewing the progress of different countries. And every like year, twice a year, there's a batch of countries that are up for review. So with Finland, as Heta mentioned, they will also be up for review. So this is one final thing, because I know I've been speaking a lot. At EU level, aside from the issue of bringing up, for example, matters to the Fundamental Rights Agency, you can also have, for example, when it comes to discrimination cases, there's EU legislation, so it's applicable to all different EU countries, which does not allow, for example, discrimination at the workplace. So if there's a question before a national court, if somebody opens a case before a national court, and they're not sure that the country is observing European law, then a national court can be asked to make what's called a preliminary reference to the European Court of Justice. So the national court will send a question to the European Court of Justice, the EU's court, saying, okay, is country X in line with EU legislation? Then the European Court will decide on that, send this decision back to the national court. The national court will have to use that decision when making its judgment. And obviously, very importantly, do check national legislation. There's a number of NGOs that deal with legal aid, for example, for vulnerable people, also for disabled people, like in a number of different entities. I've seen that there's a Validity Foundation here, for example, like represented also here, that work a lot with legal aid. So depending on the country, you can actually go to court, you can go to the ombudsman, you can actually, like, for example, in Malta, now there's a new system of redress panels. So when it actually comes to minor matters, instead of having to go to court, you can go in front of a redress panel, but then you can actually appeal that to the national courts. So also like check what different redress mechanisms there are in your country. So I mean, there's many different ways. Some ways are like stronger than others, but I mean, it's important that at the end of the day, do partner with somebody who can actually help, especially in the legal field, and do make your voice heard, because many times laws actually do not change or practices do not change because like nobody's making their voice heard. I know it's very difficult. I know like that many times the system is not accessible, but I mean, still, a start is always a start.
not always accessible. I have some experience of that, having gone and currently going through some processes for other people. These systems can be painfully slow, but I feel that they are worth engaging in everything. Every process that Alistair mentioned is worth engaging in, because I see that when people start that, it gives them a focal point and it changes their attitude. And it actually makes us change our thinking to say, yes, we do matter. Yes, this is a serious issue. Yes, we are going to speak. So actually starting to put together that message to the UNCRPD matters as a process as soon as you start it.
I would just like to thank EUCAP and European Women's Lobby for funding it, and every writer that share their stories with us, because I am absolutely sure it was incredibly difficult to write it, but it was incredible to read it. And I hope this project does have more to run after this. So we will finish the project, but I'm sure it's not going to be the end. It's actually going to be one first step into something else that we hope to continue with all of you. So if you are interested, reach out to us, share the ebook. If you want to translate to other languages, let us know. We can also do that. And we are open to more collaboration. And thank you all for being here and for the stories that you shared.